Welcome back to another episode of Pragmatic Optimists. I am Rachel Cohen. I'm an attorney. I'm joined by Rhode Island State Senator Tiara Mack. And today we are also joined by Palestinian writer and law student Ahmad Ibsais. He is going to be talking to us about new reports coming out of Gaza specific to targeting of women and children and that kind of targeting as a vehicle for genocide. So we just had a really excellent conversation with Ahmad, like locating basics of international law. Check that out if you hadn't had a chance to already. But let's get into this specific report. And just to contextualize, I know you said Francesca Albanese has released this, but for people who are not paying particularly close attention to international law, I think it would even be helpful to have a kind of framework of who is Francesca Albanese, what's her role, where is she doing this reporting to? And then if you could tell us what it says, I'm sure Tiara and I will have follow-up questions.
Yeah, she is the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, and I believe it was published in tandem with either Human Rights Watch or it was an independent UN inquiry. I forget uh, the direct source that it was published with. But the source just pretty much outlined the ways in which women have been either killed or sexually targeted or tortured or traumatized in some way, which would carry about the erasure of the Palestinian people, which was the intended goal. Um, Both of the Israeli government and in large parts the Israeli people. I think the last poll by Haaretz said that 83% of the general Israeli population supported the genocide, and there's tons of footage of Israelis blocking aid as far back as like March. So it's not like a new phenomenon. And I think if anything, uh, just perhaps the way that the Israeli government portrays the genocide has just only emboldened perhaps like support amongst the Israeli people to
Mm-hmm.
support this genocide, and oftentimes it's invoking uh, like this genocidal rhetoric, right? Going back, I think it was November 9th, 2023, like a month into it, and Netanyahu was already invoking Amalek, right? This biblical reference to wipe out, uh, you know, the unfavored group. And I think that's all goes back to occupation and apartheid. It's one group subjugating another, believing that their rights to land or life is more important or more valuable than the group that they're subjugating. So very basic level. Uh,
Yeah, I'm curious why the specific focus on women and children, and is this common in other genocide cases, or how does this change for genocide scholars the kind of database or tactics that are commonly used? We've seen forced sterilization in the U.S. with indigenous populations and with Taino people. We've also seen different groups targeted, Black and Brown individuals across many nations. How is this specific targeting of women and children different or notable in the full context of genocide scholarship?
yeah, so we can just look at like a few different of the international tribunals. There's like Rwanda and then Yugoslavia. So there is the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and then for Yugoslavia. So the ICTR and ICTY. The ICTR in a few of their cases, which are against specific individuals or perpetrators of the genocide, so they're politicians or spokespeople or whoever it was. That was the first instance in which like sexual violence or rape was considered an act of genocide. Not the killing of women specifically, but sexual violence, because it traumatized women so much that they no longer wanted to have children of like from their own ethnic group. Obviously, because rape is traumatizing in its own way. It's like that completely deterred. And the Rwandan in the tribunal, they said that the perpetrators that were doing this knew that that was going to be a result of these, mass amounts of sexual violence. So trauma as a deterring part of procreation, and it acted as like pretty much like forced birth control, right? And then in the ICTY for Yugoslavia, they said that starvation, because starving bodies can't reproduce, right? And then there's forced displacement, and you're separating the sexes of like the Bosnian of the Yugoslavian people. And then Bosnia, same idea. Women weren't being killed, but they were separated from the men who were killed, effectively trying to eliminate the Bosnian people. And that's what we're seeing in Gaza in a lot of ways. Women are being killed. So obviously, the same way that a starving person can't reproduce, a dead woman can't reproduce, right? Like she's not there. So 70% of the victims were women and children. In one report, I believe, right after the ceasefire, Israel broke the ceasefire in March, which was Ramadan of this year. The UN documented, I think, over 23 attacks where only women and children were killed, like in the immediate aftermath of that ceasefire being broken. And I think the overall average that the UN inquiry documented, and a lot of these figures stalled because no independent journalist or organizations were allowed in, or aid organizations have been allowed into Gaza, and that's a separate discussion about how Israel and the United States have demonized legitimate United international aid organizations. Separate discussion, but the latest figures were that like 37 mothers on average were killed daily. The largest IVF center in Gaza was destroyed, so over 4,000 embryos were destroyed. Maternal healthcare centers have been destroyed, along with every other hospital in Gaza that is now like partially functioning. If anything, a recent report came out about the mass amounts of like sexual violence that have been taking place in Gaza and in the West Bank to prisoners. And if I'm not mistaken, and one aid organization had reported that like almost 100% of women in Gaza are reporting depression. A lot of times because in the Arabic culture, women are the centers of our households. So one, either their children are dying and they're just depressed, their other family members are dying, or two, they're now the sole caretaker of their families and having to, one, take care of maybe their relatives' children, and two, just find a way to make life amongst the rubble and tent cities that have sprung up around Gaza. So one, we're seeing like direct killing of women and children, and then two, all of these different methods that are preventing their births, right? Of course, I'm assuming we've seen reports about women undergoing cesareans without anesthesia. We can only imagine the trauma that takes place there. I'm assuming that they're you know deterred from ever trying to have a child again after undergoing that amount of pain, right? So it's all of these different strategies are taking place to, one, kill women, and then two, prevent like the repopulation of the Palestinian people.
And that's very heavy, and I appreciate you contextualizing it for our viewers. There's one counter argument that I don't think people watching our show would ever make, but I'm sure are confronted with it sometimes. And when I say counter argument, I think it's incredibly bad faith and gross. But I'd like to give you a chance to address it, because when we're focused on reproductive health in Gaza, what I have seen some insane people say online is that it can't possibly be a genocide because the population has increased over the course of the last X number of years. And number one, we're obviously not getting continued accurate data coming out of Gaza and probably now even the West Bank. But number two, that's not how genocide works. And I was hoping you could explain that a little bit more for people that are wondering, well, if this is really, or who hopefully themselves are not wondering, though if you are, we're going to explain why that's not correct, but have been confronted by people wondering, if this is a genocide, why are there not more deaths? Which is a terrible counter argument, just for the record. But
Like
in
you
the
mentioned,
international law context, especially, is that
yeah,
necessary? Is that real, or are people full
yeah. Well, I think the law shouldn't be necessary to like explain basic morality, right? Um, just on your last point, like you mentioned, the stats have really been paused
Mhm.
for a while, but uh, there is research out there. Forgive me, I forget the source, but it's like the average life expectancy in Gaza dropped about 30 years, from like 75 years now it's about 45 years. So like that fact alone kind of like
Mhm.
tells you, obviously, people are dying a lot faster and a lot sooner. And as we mentioned in our last episode, international law doesn't have a threshold for the amount of people that have to be killed for it to be considered genocide. But the numbers alone, I mean, to tell you, like independent estimates are saying over 200,000, some saying 400,000 or 500,000 have been killed. That's over 10% of the Gazan population in 2 years. Why Israel didn't kill the Gazans as fast? Perhaps it's in their wartime strategy, so less opposition to maybe a country waking up and saying let's stop them. If it took place in a month, I'm sure I would like to hope maybe somebody would have went in 2 years. They created enough diplomatic cover for them to just continue the genocide. And now, the sham of a ceasefire that was never really a ceasefire, and aid still not being allowed in. I've seen some scholars argue that even though there is a ceasefire, the way that Gazans have not been allowed to rebuild and aid is still not being allowed in, it's still part of the genocide, because although people are not perhaps dying at the same rate, these are all measures intended to prevent births or to get the Gazan people to leave Gaza. And right now, if we look at it, Israel is still gaining control of over 58% of the Gaza Strip. So separate from genocide, that's just like ethnic cleansing. They took over 58% of Gaza's land and left them, I can't do math, 32%, 42%. 42%.
This is a lawyer's channel. It's okay.
42% of land that's pretty much just all been destroyed. So what type of life can they rebuild there? Or do we as a society expect them to rebuild there? And I think that's a hard choice, right? We can't expect them to stay on land when there's no future for their children. But then the alternative is to leave and probably never had the opportunity to return, because I don't see Israel allowing Gazans to return in any way, shape, or form. Same thing with Israeli settlements. Palestinians are kicked off their land and unable to return. The last 3 years have seen more settlement expansion than settlement expansion since the Oslo Accords. So that's another international law violation for another day. But time and time again, the point is that we see, one, Israel is preventing Palestinians from returning to their homes, or two, just flat out stealing the homes or killing them.
And that is unfortunately a good, if depressing, place to stop. But I think that, Ahmad, we'll have to have you back. And for viewers that would like to follow along with more consistent updates and more of a focus on what's happening in Palestine from a Palestinian student who obviously can explain things really, really well, you can follow along with Ahmad's work at State of Siege. You've published recently in The Guardian and a couple other places documenting and explaining this for people. So check him out on Substack. Continue to subscribe, follow along here to Legal AF on the Midas Touch Network. And Tiara and I will see y'all soon. Thanks so much again for joining us.
Thank you all for listening.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.